about the maths of crime.
Crime.
Yeah.
For people who don't know, you're a proper mathematician,
Yep.
and we're really getting into your research.
One of the things that's important to know about crime or terrorism, things like that, is when it's going to happen. There's a bit of old maths that kind of helps us start off understanding that. And that's something called the Poisson distribution, named after a guy called Poisson.
Oh.
But the main point about Poisson distribution and its first practical application was looking in the Prussian army. There were lots of soldiers who were dying from being kicked by horses over a number of years.
By their own horses?
By their own horses, yeah. The horses objecting to being used as an army horse, perhaps. And so there was one guy called Bortagowitz in 1898 who was tasked with looking into how frequently these horse attacks were happening, these horse kick attacks were happening.
Horse attacks?
Horse attacks.
They sound more dramatic all of a sudden. Okay.
I know, it does. I know, I'm sorry. And it's actually quite a serious thing. The point is that I like to think, anyway, horse kicks are generally independent, right? Horses don't sort of collude with each other and decide that they're all going to kick up a ruckus on a particular day. So if you look at a timeline of instance then, you would sort of expect your instance, your horse kick instance, to be kind of randomly distributed across this thing. So maybe you'd have a couple very quickly after each other. But what that means that you can do is if you take a time interval, so a set number of years perhaps, and you look at the chances of a particular number of instants in that interval, then it follows this really nice, neat distribution, which looks like this. And this is your probability, and this is your number of instants. And this is your Poisson distribution. So that means that there's an average number of instants that you expect in a year, say, and that average number of instants is the most likely thing to occur. That has the highest probability of all. So it might mean that, in 1890 you only have, one instant perhaps, and then in 1891 you have a huge number of instants, but also a very low probability. But that most years you're going to expect to have something around the average rate of instants. It means that you can start looking at the time between different events, and you can start coming up with sort of a susceptibility for events. But there's one really crucial thing that this stuff is missing, that the Poisson distribution is missing, which is that events and crime and terror attacks and things like that, they're not completely independent. So if one happens, the chances of another one happening very soon after really increase, and the Poisson distribution can't take that into account. So the first people to look at events that weren't completely independent were scientists who were studying earthquakes. Now, you could say that perhaps earthquakes were completely random and Poisson distributed, so each earthquake was independent of every other. But the thing is that if you have one earthquake, you're going to be really likely to have aftershocks, right? So a series of earthquakes in the same place in quick succession of one another. Scientists and mathematicians developed something called the Hawkes process, which I think might be named after hawks actually. So they came up with something called the Hawkes process, which takes into account the fact that events aren't completely independent of one another. So instead, if you're looking at an earthquake, you'd expect to have something much more like this. One earthquake happen, and then you'd expect a few more smaller earthquakes to happen within a really short space of time. And then perhaps you'd go a little while, you'd have one with no aftershocks, and then another, but with another few sort of aftershocks tagged on quite quickly afterwards. I mean, things kind of take a bit more of this pattern. But the thing that's nice is that, nice probably isn't the right word, but is that crime follows this same pattern. So if you take burglaries, for example, anybody who's been burgled will know that your chance of being burgled again within a really short space of time hugely increases. And this is something called repeat victimisation. And the reason is that burglars get to know the layout of your house, they get to know where you keep your valuables, they get to know all sorts of things about your local area. So your chance of being burgled again increases, but so does your neighbours and your neighbours' neighbours and your neighbours' 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 neighbours and so on as you go along down the street. This Hawkes process then of seeing events as connected in time means that you can then model what happens with burglaries statistically. It goes beyond just sort of saying, oh, well, obviously that happens, because you're actually able to describe it and capture it using numbers and using equations. And as soon as you can do that, then you can start actually implementing genuine strategies back into the real world. But what this means, knowing that there's this model that sits behind the scenes, is that you can actually assign numbers. There's a proper equation for this. So you have your kind of background rate. One here, you're going to be talking about your intensity of attacks, how likely it is for an event to occur within a short space of time. So you'll have some sort of a background rate. So this is like your randomness, because there is still some element of complete randomness in this. But then every time an event happens, you have a little kick. So your chances of another event get a little boost, right? And that's what this thing here does. But then finally, this boost, it doesn't last for very long. So it looks like this. Hang on. So your little kick, your chance of another event happening, boosts up and then dies away quite quickly in time. You're summing over all of the incidents that have happened in the past, and you're working out your kick from every possible incident. Yeah?
Hannah, is this all hindsight, or does this give like predictive powers, or is this just something you apply afterwards and go, oh yeah, I can see?
Oh, that's nice, yeah. Well, so this example is all retrospective, but what I think is really exciting about these ideas is that you can also apply them in real time. So with burglary in particular, if you're just looking at how the past influences the present and will influence the future, which this allows you to do by talking about intensity and susceptibility of burglaries, what that means is that in real time you can pick up on a particular area or even a particular street that is more likely to be the centre of our burglary hotspot going forward in time by using these methods. So there's a company in America called Predpol who were the first to take these equations and wrap it up neatly into sort of an iPad app, effectively, so that they can give it to different police forces across the US, and the police forces will then get a printout on basically a map with like a red square saying, here is where is most likely to be victims of burglary or car theft tonight. So just by looking at these really simple equations, putting in the numbers of the system and reacting to what the maths tells you, they've reduced burglary by up to 32% in certain areas of the States.
It's like a pre-crime. This is
Minority
Minority Report.
Yeah. Predictive policing, that's what they call it, yeah.
So, as the authorities get smarter and the police get smarter and start using mathematics to, fight crime, could criminals start using mathematics to plan crime?
Well, I hope not.